Greetings and welcome back. I thought it might be interesting on occasion to occasionally intersperse the historical content with more contemporary issues, if you will, but still issues germane to language and linguistics. Contemporary isn't really the right word, but issues that are related to language and linguistics, but may in fact deviate from the specific narrative that I've embarked on, which for the moment is the history of the English language. So today we're going to be looking at prescriptivism versus descriptivism. Now the first question you might have is, what is prescriptivism and what is descriptivism? Well, if you recall your childhood in school, whatever your native tongue might be, you might remember learning certain rules in school for how to speak and how to write. And these are what we call prescriptive rules. They are the rules that are literally prescribed to you. But in linguistics, linguists use the term descriptivism. Most linguists are descriptivists as opposed to prescriptivists. Descriptivism, or the descriptive approach or model, is simply the model of how language actually is used and actually is spoken. And this is true for every language that has a written standard or a formal spoken standard versus other variants. And these often come into conflict. Prescriptivists certainly come into conflict with descriptivists. Now, I myself, of course, have to be a descriptivist because, well, I'm scientifically literate and I like to consider myself someone who adheres to scientific principles, and there's simply no evidence to suggest any truth whatsoever to a prescriptive approach. However, there's no denying that a prescriptive model has its utility. Now, let's first understand the origins of prescriptivism versus descriptivism as a model for language. Now, it actually goes way, way, way back. You can see prescriptive models offered in antiquity. But the real coming of age for the prescriptivist model, or the prescriptive model, is probably the 18th century and the 19th century, because this was the time when the emergence of the nation state and massive consolidation of socioeconomic power were centered around certain areas in certain countries. So first off, we have to understand how a language standard comes about to begin with. A language standard, that is a standard that the majority of people adhere to, at least technically speaking, this has nothing to do with the standard itself being superior or inferior or anything else. Usually this has to do with the socioeconomic status of the speakers of said standard. And this socioeconomic status is then associated with a particular location. So if you look at the history of English, during most of the Old English period, particularly the late Old English period, the socioeconomic concentration of power, the hegemonic focal point of power, was Wessex, which is in the southwest of England. And when the Norman conquest occurred, and certainly afterwards, there was a reconcentration of power towards the southeast, specifically towards London. And as you see, this has nothing to do with the linguistic status of the language, but with a shift in hegemonic power. The same is true, of course, in France. For a long time during the Middle Ages, despite Paris being important, the southern varieties of French and the languages such as Provençal that are not properly French, but rather some kind of mixture between Italian and French, for lack of a better description, were wildly popular in the use of poetry, for example. I'm sure you've heard of the troubadours. And much of that, of course, was the basis for Dante and his writing of the Divine Comedy. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, as France became a powerful colonial nation, if you will, with a consolidation of the crown very much centered in Paris, this brought about the slow and sometimes rapid extirpation of other languages, as well as, in particular, competing variants of French. And this is also the time, not coincidentally, that you see the emergence of l'Académie Française, which, of course, is a prescriptive institute that was designed in the 17th century to pursue linguistic purity and offer prescriptions for how French was to be spoken. And many countries have had this in the past. But by and large, none of these prescriptive approaches have ever worked. Language changes, and language is and always shall be defined by its speakers. That said, as I said, there's an argument for the utility of having a certain standard, a universal standard, if you will. But I just wanted to give a little background as to how prescriptive standards come about. Very often there's some tangible or sometimes intangible connection between the emergence of the nation state and prescriptive standards. Now, as far as the nitty-gritty details go, we can start by something fairly simple. Let's take something that many English speakers indulge in. I myself don't do this. I'm pretty prescriptive in my speech and writing, if only because I spent way too much time in academia, and I also have classical training in Greek and Latin, and I don't know, just that's the way it's worked with me. But many English speakers will use a phrase such as, "Me and him went to the cinema," "Me and him went to the movies." This is descriptively fine, but prescriptively, people will balk at this. Prescriptivists don't like this. The reason for prescriptivists not liking this is because me and him are object pronouns. That is, if you remember the last video when I talked about cases, they're not in the subject case, and according to prescriptivists, this is not a possible sentence because it would have to be he and I went to the cinema or he and I went to the movies. But once again, this is not how language works, and people do and they say and they do these kinds of things, and most people find this perfectly okay. I myself would not speak this way, but like I said, I've had prescriptive approaches to language drummed and drilled into me for well over a decade, well over 15 years, so it's difficult for me. But this is perfectly fine. So this is a small example of prescriptive versus descriptive approach, say in English. Another example of this is more recent, is particularly in American English, which is my native language, is the lack of distinction in the so-called existential construction there is versus there are. Many Americans these days, even fairly educated ones, will simply make a statement such as, there's lots of cars in the parking lot, there's lots of people, so you have this there's, as opposed to there are. Now, the issue that prescriptivists would have with this is that this construction lacks agreement. And what do I mean by agreement? That is to say, the copula, which is a fancy term for the verb to be, the conjugation doesn't agree with the number. That is, there are lots of cars, which would be the formal prescriptive approach, versus the descriptive approach, there's lots of cars. But that's, once again, how people speak. And native speakers who use this construction clearly don't care very much about agreement, because if they did, they wouldn't be using it. And this isn't a really serious issue. French and its existential construction, or rather there are constructions, doesn't care. Il y a des voitures, il y a une voiture, whether it's one or several. it doesn't really matter. There is a car. There are cars. French uses the same construction. So this just doesn't matter to speakers. But prescriptivists get upset because there's a lack of existential agreement, and the list goes on and on. One thing you'll see in written internet discourse often is something, or even spoken much more often than written, but you'll see it written as, I could have did better, I could have went to the store earlier, things like that, as opposed to I could have done better, or I could have gone to the store. And once again, prescriptivist issue with this would be that you're not using the past participle, you're using the simple past, or the imperfect, or the preterite, and you're also not using the right auxiliary verb. Some people literally write, I've seen this in the internet, I could of, as opposed to could have, or could of went. But this is, like I said, many native speakers, particularly of the American variety, will use this construction, and it's fairly common. Another one that is considered prescriptively incorrect, that's very common in UK English, is he was sat someplace, as opposed to he was sitting someplace. Very, very common in British English. He was sat at the counter. He was something to that effect. And this doesn't just apply to grammar. Of course, pronunciation is another one. You have a wide variety of pronunciations in most languages, often the case, not always. And there is usually one that's based on socioeconomic status that's regarded as more prestigious than others. For many, many years in the United Kingdom, the so-called received pronunciation, which is sort of an official term for Queen's English, if you will, was the chosen standard. But in time, this is really disintegrated. Very, very, very few people speak RP, as we refer to it, received pronunciation. Most of you are, of course, fans and acolytes of Gopher. He most certainly does not have an RP accent. In fact, it's very clear that specifically what his accent is, but it's not RP. And most people don't have that either. In my city of origin, for example, New York City, this has disappeared over the years, but there's still a distinction between socioeconomic class, often, in that many British varieties and certain sociolects of New York English are not what we say non-rhotic. That is to say, in intervocalic positions between vowels, the R won't be pronounced. So many people of my parents' generation would not say something like York, rather, but York, or as turkey, or things like that, pork. And once again, but there was an extensive study in the 1970s by a very, very famous sociolinguist by the name of William Labov, and he did a very extensive investigation of these sociolectical varieties and how clearly the socioeconomic status of the speaker and the association of that socioeconomic status with a particular pronunciation, that was the main determinant of so-called proper speech, or what people regarded as proper speech in terms of pronunciation. Now, mass media, which has in the past, radio and television have served to smooth out these differences very often. Certainly mass media, and in the sense of television and radio in the past, have served to further standards and pronunciation. Few people of my generation, I don't have a New York accent whatsoever, but few people, and that's because I many reasons. I've been an English teacher in the past. I've lived in myriad countries. I simply don't have it. But even if you were to take a lifer, if you will, someone who spent most of his life in New York City, from my generation onwards, the likelihood that he or she would have a non-rhotic accent, depending on the socioeconomic background, but even less depending on that these days, it's just not there. I mean, that's what mass communication via radio and television have done. However, what's quite interesting with regards to the internet, which I guess you can regard as the ultimate form of mass communication, it is the mass communication of the future, is that quite the opposite effect of what we've seen regarding radio and television in the 20th century has been the case with internet. The internet, where virtually everyone is a participant in and where people write things sort of willy-nilly, seems to serve the dissolution of standards rather than the consolidation of standards, which is somewhat seems paradoxical and yet is not. Remember, radio and television usually were presented and offered to the public in an official capacity. That is to say that these means of communication, these media, stem or had stemmed from official channels, government, and by official, of course, I mean the channels that would offer prescriptive standards for language. The BBC, perfect example. The BBC is publicly funded, and presumably those of socioeconomic status were, at least originally, the primary donors, although that's changed over the years. And likewise, even if these institutions are private, very often they have the government's ear. So, mass television media in the United States, for example, you all know the reporter voice, right? The reporter voice, which is universal in American English, which no one speaks that way unless they actually try to speak this way, the way I'm speaking now. No one speaks this way. Right? That's the reporter voice. You're probably familiar with that. Once again, official channels. What's interesting, what's not paradoxical about the internet, if you actually examine the contents, is that the internet is willy-nilly. There's no real center of control there, unless people are going to express themselves linguistically as they're accustomed to. There's no regulation. And that's why you see the variety, the non-standard variety that you do, and particularly the descriptive variety that you do in any given comment section on a YouTube video, in English at least, and as well as other languages. You'll see a whole slew of non-standard, descriptive models of language. And that's because there's just no regulation of that. However, in spite of all of that, I do feel that prescriptive standards serve a use or serve some utilitarian purpose. Me being so out of the loop as I am, or have been for many years, I don't know what the standards are these days in the United States. But I do know that far more so in the current generation than my generation, there's a lot of confusion as to the differentiation between prescriptive standards and descriptive standards in American English. When I think about, for example, the distinctions that I had to learn, and then again, my background, of course, is very differentiated. I mean, I've studied Latin and ancient Greek and all these, clearly I have a different perspective on these things, but even in school, from what I can dimly recollect from those times, there was not... there was certainly a distinction, and one was at least intuitively aware of the distinction. But I think things have gone topsy-turvy in a large sense, and whether or not this is ultimately destructive or not is kind of irrelevant. Like I said, descriptivism always wins. That's the way, because people speak as they're accustomed to. People, I think, in my observation, are letting more and more of descriptive use sort of blend or bleed over into the prescriptive use. Many people can't distinguish between the two. I don't think there are many people left, in my observation, that even bother distinguishing, say, the existential construction there are. So just as an example, in 50 years' time, I suspect theirs, as opposed to there is, there are, will become a standard universally, even in written speech and official discourse. And this is just the trend. But the other thing, another thing, to whom it may concern. This is very official, sounds very official, so people will often use it incorrectly, even because they don't understand the function of whom, which is more or less has died out. I mean, virtually no one uses whom anymore, and if they do, or if people do, it's very often, well, they don't understand that it's an object, and so it's gone out the window. I suspect that whom in 100 years' time maybe will be completely gone from the English language, just an archaic relic. So if I have any concerns, which I don't really, regarding these trends, it's that prescriptive standards have a utilitarian function, but there are varying degrees of bleed over. There you go. There are varying, as opposed there. Bleed over from descriptive models of speech into the prescriptive realm, and I think the distinction is handy to keep to bear in mind. Now, mind you, this is nothing unique to English. Every language has this. French, be it pronunciation or otherwise, or grammar. French, German, Turkish, Korean, Danish. This is just a universal, and the contention that one form of variety or variety of a language is better than the other is also kind of a universal. People have been claiming this. It's almost always based on socioeconomic status. For example, in South Korea, the denizens of Seoul look down upon the southern denizens because of their speech patterns, because, well, it doesn't conform to what's regarded as the national standard, which originated in Seoul as the capital city. And so this is just how that works. But it doesn't really matter what I think or what you think or anyone thinks, because language will change as it changes, and people will speak it as they speak. And I think at some point in time, in a few decades, if I'm still alive, my speech will become essentially fossilized, the manner in which I speak, because that's my background. As I get older, I move away from contemporary speech, and I don't live in an Anglo-Saxon environment anymore, so it sort of becomes fossilized in a way. Anyway, I just wanted to give a brief overview of descriptivism versus prescriptivism, and as a sort of a side issue, because there are so many issues and topics in language and linguistics. Can't possibly cover them all, but this is, of course, another topic, unrelated, but related somehow to the historical stuff I've been doing. So I hope you enjoyed that, and everyone take care.